The air in the glass conservatory was thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of Alara's own blood. She lay sprawled on the cold tiles, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as Vervain stood over her, the silver pitcher glinting like an executioner's blade. Behind him, a circle of heirs, dressed in cashmere and diamonds, watched with a boredom that was more terrifying than active hatred. To them, she wasn't human, she was a curiosity to be dissected. "Another drop, Alara," Julian whispered, his voice smooth and toxic. "For science." He tilted the pitcher. The liquid Vervain, glowing with a sickly violet luminescence, splashed across her inner wrist. The reaction was instantaneous. Her flesh didn't just burn. It hissed, the skin blackening and peeling back in curls of charred ruin. Alara's scream was a raw, guttural sound that tore at her throat, vibrating against the glass walls until the very foundations seemed to shiver. The elite laughed, a light, tinkling sound that mocked her agony. They saw a weak, orphaned assistant breaking under the weight of their games, unaware that every nerve ending on fire was sending a flare through the psychic ether. 50 miles away, beneath the frostbitten earth of the Blackridge estate, the silence of 2 centuries was shattered. In the deepest vault of the Thorn Catacombs, Lord Valerus's heart, a withered, motionless stone, gave a single, violent thud. The mental link, usually a gentle, hum-like frequency designed to anchor Alara's fledgling soul, had suddenly become a searing brand. He didn't just feel her pain, he lived it. He felt the silver bite of the toxin, the mockery of the laughter, and the terrifying cold of her fading heartbeat. His eyes snapped open, 2 voids of predatory crimson that sucked the light from the room. There was no slow awakening, no period of groggy transition. One moment the tomb was a graveyard. The next, it was a pressure cooker of ancient, redirected fury. With a single flick of his wrist, the 3-ton stone lid of his sarcophagus was sent hurtling into the far wall, reducing it to powder. He moved not as a man, but as a blur of displaced shadow. The heavy iron doors of the manor exploded outward as he hit them, the hinges snapping like dry twigs. The forest outside became a smear of dark green and gray as he ran, his speed so great that the air roared in his wake, snapping the branches of ancient oaks like they were nothing more than matchsticks. He was a force of nature, a god of the night stripped of his civility. The link was screaming now, a frantic pulse that told him she was slipping toward the true death. The king wasn't coming for a parley. He was coming for a massacre. Alara's vision began to fracture, the ornate patterns of the conservatory ceiling dissolving into a kaleidoscope of blurred gold and gray. The pain from the Vervain had moved past the stage of screaming fire and into a numbing, heavy cold. It was a sign she knew all too well from her botanical studies. The body was surrendering. Her heart, that fragile muscle Valerus had so carefully restarted, stuttered in her chest like a dying moth's wings. Each beat felt more distant than the last, a fading echo in a deep, dark well. As the taunting voices of Julian and his companions drifted away into a muffled drone, her mind retreated into the only warmth it had left, the memory of the night she should have died the first time. She remembered the rain, a relentless deluge that had turned the mountain pass into a river of mud and jagged stone. She had been left for dead after the carriage accident, her lungs filling with fluid and her ribs crushed. In the freezing dark, she had seen him. He hadn't appeared as a monster then, but as a shadow carved from the night itself. Valerus Thorn had knelt in the dirt, his fine silk coat ruined, his expression one of profound, ancient weariness that shifted into something sharper the moment their eyes met. "Not today, little bird," he had whispered. The memory of his bite was not one of violence, but of a terrifyingly beautiful surge of heat. He had shared his blood, weaving his very essence into her shattered veins to knit them back together. In those first hours of her rebirth, the link had formed, a golden tether of consciousness that allowed him to carry the weight of her trauma while her own mind recovered. He had been the anchor that kept her from drifting into madness, a silent sentinel in the back of her thoughts who smoothed over the jagged edges of her fear. Now, that tether was vibrating with a violent, rhythmic intensity. Through the fog of her failing senses, Ilara felt the link flare with a white-hot resonance. It wasn't the gentle hum she was used to, it was a thunderous demand for her to stay, to hold on, to breathe. She could feel his fury, a cold, crystalline rage that tasted of ozone and ancient earth. It was the only thing keeping her soul pinned to her body as the Vervain toxin tried to dissolve her spirit. "Valerus," she tried to moan, but her lips wouldn't move. The conservatory doors didn't just open, they ceased to exist. A shockwave of pressure slammed into the room, shattering the rare orchids and cracking the glass panes overhead. The laughter of the elite died instantly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like lead. Ilara closed her eyes, a single tear tracking through the soot on her cheek. The king was here, and the embers of her life, which had nearly flickered out, began to catch fire once more in the shadow of his presence. The heavy wrought-iron gates of Ethelgard did not simply open. They groaned as the molecular integrity of the steel surrendered to a force it was never designed to withstand. Valerus did not break the locks. He moved through the threshold as if the physical world were merely a suggestion, the metal shrieking and twisting back like scorched paper in his wake. The two private security guards, veterans of elite military units, didn't even have time to raise their tactical rifles. They were not hit. They were simply displaced by the wake of his movement, thrown aside like autumn leaves caught in the slipstream of a high-speed train. He did not run now. To run would be to acknowledge the distance. And for Valerus Thorn, distance had ceased to exist the moment Ilara's agony spiked through their shared consciousness. He walked up the grand, manicured driveway with a predatory grace that turned the air around him into a vacuum. Every street lamp he passed shattered in a rhythmic sequence of sparks, unable to contain the surge of static energy radiating from his skin. The opulent marble lions guarding the entrance to the main estate cracked as he stepped between them, the very stone recoiling from the weight of his intent. The secondary security detail at the grand oak doors fared no better. One man reached for a taser, his fingers trembling as he felt the temperature in the foyer drop 20 degrees in a heartbeat. Before he could squeeze the trigger, the heavy doors were blown inward by a gust of pressurized shadow. Valerus stepped over the splintered remains of the entrance, his boots clicking with terrifying precision on the checkered marble floor. His tailored suit was pristine, his dark hair undisturbed, but his eyes were no longer human. They were two glowing embers of ancient, celestial wrath that seemed to pierce through the very walls of the mansion. Electronic alarms wailed, a high-pitched frantic screaming that filled the hallways, but Valerus ignored them. He followed the golden thread of the link, the pulsating line of fire that led him directly toward the scent of ozone and burning vervain. A servant dropped a tray of crystal flutes, the glass shattering unnoticed as the shadow of the north passed by. He didn't speak, he didn't growl. The silence he carried with him was far more lethal. It was the silence of a tomb that had been forced open, a quiet promise of total, systematic erasure for anyone standing between a king and his fledgling. As he reached the gilded handles of the conservatory, the air itself began to hum with the frequency of a coming storm. The gilded handles of the conservatory doors didn't turn. They liquefied. Under the palm of Valerus's hand, the brass ran like water, and the heavy glass panels burst outward in a glittering spray of diamonds. He stepped into the floral sanctuary, his presence so massive it seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. The elite heirs, caught in the middle of a cruel jest, froze like statues in a museum of the damned. Julian Vane, still clutching the silver pitcher of Vervain, felt his knees turn to water as he looked into eyes that had watched empires fall. The casual arrogance that had defined the young man's life vanished, replaced by an ancestral, marrow-deep terror. "You," Valerus said, his voice a low, vibrating chord that made the remaining glass panes rattle in their frames. He didn't scream. He didn't need to. The sheer gravity of his aura pinned them to the spot, making it impossible for them to even draw breath. You used a king's blood to play a commoner's game. Valerus moved, a blur of motion that defied the human eye, and in the next heartbeat, he was kneeling beside Alara. The sight of her blackened skin, the smell of the vervain still eating into her delicate shoulder, caused a ripple of shadow to erupt from him, blacking out the sun filtering through the dome. With a tenderness that defied his terrifying power, he gathered her into his arms. He ignored the poison that hissed against his own skin as he touched her. To a king of his lineage, the vervain was a mere sting, though to her, it had been a death sentence. "Alara," he whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "Reach for me." Closing his eyes, he forced the link open, widening the psychic channel until it was a roaring river of vitality. He didn't just give her his strength, he commanded her cells to remember their immortality. Through the bond, he poured centuries of accumulated life force, a surge of crimson light that pulsed visibly beneath her skin. The onlookers watched in horrific fascination as the blackened tracks on Alara's neck began to knit together. The blisters receded, the charred flesh sloughing off to reveal pristine, porcelain skin underneath. The shallow, thready gasps of a dying girl transformed into a deep, steady breath as her heart synchronized with his, two pulses, one ancient and one new, beating in a perfect, thunderous unison. The link, which had been a scream of agony, settled into a low, protective hum. Alara's eyes fluttered open, the clouded gray replaced by a spark of his own reflected fire. Valerus stood slowly, his hand still cradling the back of her head, as he turned his gaze back to the shivering circle of aristocrats. The healing was done. Now, the debt remained to be paid. The transition from the chaos of Ethelgard to the stillness of the Black Ridge estate felt like emerging from a fever dream into a bath of ice and starlight. Valerus had carried Alara across the jagged peaks of the northern territories, his speed blurring the world until the air itself turned to a soft, rushing velvet. Now, she lay wrapped in heavy silks within a bedchamber carved directly into the living obsidian of the mountain. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside, the only sound was the crackle of a hearth fire and the rhythmic, dual thrumming of their hearts. Valerus stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the moon. The fury had retreated, replaced by a brooding, protective silence that felt as heavy as the stones surrounding them. Alara sat up, her fingers tracing the smooth skin of her wrist where the vervain had once carved deep into her marrow. The scars were gone, erased by the king's intervention, but the memory of the link, that blinding white bridge of fire, remained vivid. "I could feel you," she whispered, her voice still raspy. "Not just your power. I felt your thoughts. I felt your fear for me." Valerus turned, his golden eyes softened but distant. "That is the burden of the stabilizer, Alara. While you are new, my mind must act as the scaffolding for yours. The link ensures you do not shatter during the transformation, but it is a tether, not a touch." He moved closer, stopping just short of the bed, maintaining a distance that felt deliberate and agonizing. "As long as the link is active, your feelings are filtered through my own. You cannot truly know what you feel for me, and I cannot touch your soul without the risk of overwhelming it." He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had leveled a city's gates. "The link protects you, but it also creates a cage of obligation. We are connected by necessity, not yet by choice. Only when the pulse in your mind fades, when you are stable enough to stand in the dark alone, can we truly bridge the distance between us." Alara looked at him, realizing that the very bond that had saved her life was the one thing keeping his heart at bay. In the soundproofed war room of the Vervain estate, the air was thick with the scent of expensive scotch and desperate, sweating ego. Julian Vane sat at the head of a mahogany table, his face a mask of bruised pride and trembling fury. To men like his father, the governor, the world was a series of problems that could be solved with a wire transfer or a discreetly placed bullet. They had spent decades buying silence and loyalty, and they could not comprehend a power that didn't care for their currency. They saw Valerus not as an ancient sovereign, but as a freakish anomaly, a beast that had dared to bleed their bank accounts and humiliate their name. "I don't care about the cost," the governor hissed, slamming a folder onto the table. "He is one man. Or one monster. It doesn't matter. Find the sides. Tell them we want the girl back and the man's head on a spike." The sides were a shadow unit of mercenaries, men who specialized in the exotic and the unexplainable, equipped with ultraviolet strobes and silver nitrate rounds. They were the apex predators of the human world, but the Vains were making a fatal error in calculation. They were measuring Valerus's age in decades when they should have been measuring it in eons. They viewed him as a squatter in a mountain fortress, unaware that the very banks they used, the very land titles they held, and the ancient treaties that allowed their secret society to exist were all threads in a web Valerus Thorn had spun before their ancestors had even learned to read. As the governor signed the contract, a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning swept through the room. They didn't see the way the shadows in the corners of the room deepened, or how the reflection in the windows seemed to ripple. They were children playing with matches in a cathedral of gunpowder. They believed their wealth made them gods, never realizing that the man they were hunting was the reason the dark was something to fear in the first place. By the time the mercenaries were dispatched to the Black Ridge Peaks, the trap wasn't being set for Valerus, it was being sprung on the Vains. The transition began not with a bang, but with a terrifying, hollow silence. For weeks, Ilara had lived with the constant, rhythmic hum of Valerus's mind beneath her own, a psychic heartbeat that had buffered her from the cold and the dark. But as her own cells finally stabilized, the golden tether began to fray. The warmth in the back of her skull receded like a tide, leaving behind an aching stillness she hadn't felt since her rebirth. For the first time, her thoughts were entirely her own, stripped of his ancient strength and the secondary layer of courage he had lent her. Standing on the obsidian balcony overlooking the mist-shrouded valleys, Ilara felt a sudden, sharp pang of vulnerability. Without the link, the world felt dangerously large and Valerus felt dangerously distant. She looked at him as he leaned against the stone archway, his expression unreadable now that she could no longer feel the resonance of his soul. The safety he provided was absolute, a fortress of shadow and bone that no mercenary could breach. It would be easy to cling to him out of fear, to beg him to restore the bond just to avoid the crushing weight of her own solitude. But as she watched the moonlight catch the silver in his hair, she realized she didn't want the maker, she wanted the man. She didn't want the safety of a tethered mind, she wanted the heat of a voluntary heart. The choice crystallized in the silence. She could be a protected fledgling forever, or she could step into the quiet as his equal. She took a step toward him, her pulse steady and entirely her own, choosing the fire of the unknown over the comfort of a cage. The ballroom of the governor's estate was a cathedral of glass and ego, dripping with chandeliers that cast a fractured light over Ethelgard's elite. They gathered to celebrate their perceived victory, whispering over crystal flutes about the disappearance of the botanical girl as if she were a spill wiped from a marble floor. The governor stood at the center of the room, his chest puffed with the false bravado of the mercenaries he had stationed in the shadows. But the music didn't stop, it died. The air in the room suddenly curdled, growing heavy with the scent of crushed lilies and ancient, approaching thunder. The grand doors did not open. They were simply rendered irrelevant as Valerus Thorn stepped into the light. He was a vision of regal lethality in a charcoal suit, but it was the woman on his arm who stole the breath from the room. Ilara did not enter as the broken orphan they remembered. She wore a gown of crimson silk that looked like flowing blood, her skin glowing with a terrifying, ethereal vitality. The scars they had carved with Vervain were replaced by a radiance that made the diamonds in the room look like dull pebbles. She moved with a predatory grace that mirrored the king's, her grey eyes sharp and focused, no longer downcast in plea or prayer. As she stepped into the circle of her former tormentors, the temperature plummeted. Julian Vane dropped his glass, the shards echoing like gunshots in the sudden silence. Ilara didn't scream or shrink away. She simply smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of the lips that promised a reckoning. The poor girl was gone, and in her place stood a nightmare draped in elegance, a fledgling who had survived the fire and returned to claim the ashes. The silence in the ballroom was not peace. It was the breathless pause of a guillotine blade at the top of its arc. Valerus stepped back, his shadow lengthening across the floor like a stains of ink, ceding the center of the room to Ilara. He was no longer her shield. He was her witness. Julian Vane tried to scramble toward the exit, his face a pale mask of sweat, but the air around him solidified into a wall of cold pressure. Ilara walked toward him, her crimson heels clicking a slow, rhythmic death knell on the marble. When she reached him, she didn't use the brutal strength Valerus had gifted her. Instead, she leaned in, her voice a soft, melodic chill that carried to every corner of the frozen room. "You thought the Vervain would show the world what I was, Julian," she whispered, her eyes glowing with a sudden, predatory spark. "But all it did was show me who you are." With a flick of her wrist, she didn't strike him. She took what the Vanes valued more than life. She dropped a handful of charred, blackened silver coins at his feet, the exact price the governor had paid the mercenaries, who now lay as husks in the mountain snow. At that moment, the lights of the estate flickered and died as Valerus's influence systematically erased the Vane family's digital empire, their holdings, and their names from every ledger in the world. Julian fell to his knees, realizing that the girl he had tortured had not just survived, she had eclipsed him. Ilara looked down at him, her transition finally complete. She wasn't a victim, and she wasn't just a fledgling. She was the storm that followed the king. She turned away from the wreckage of their lives, her heart beating in a fierce, independent rhythm, and walked back into the arms of the only man who truly saw her. The mountain air was crystalline, a sharp contrast to the suffocating opulence of the world they had left in ruins. Back at the Blackridge estate, the obsidian walls seemed to pulse with a different energy, not the frantic, forced resonance of a maker and a fledgling, but a quiet, expectant hum. Ilara stood on the balcony, watching the first fingers of dawn touch the peaks. For the first time since the carriage accident, the back of her mind was a silent sanctuary. The link was gone. The golden tether that had anchored her soul through the fire had finally dissolved, leaving her standing entirely on her own strength. She felt Valerus before she saw him, but it was no longer a psychic intrusion. It was the shift in the air, the scent of cedar and old parchment, and the sheer weight of his presence behind her. He didn't move to steady her. He didn't need to. She was stable, her spirit forged into something as enduring as the mountain itself. "It's quiet," she said, her voice steady and clear. "The silence is the final gift of the transition," Valerus replied, stepping into the moonlight. He stood at the edge of her personal space, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting for a signal that was no longer mandatory. The power imbalance that had defined their relationship, the king and the orphan, the savior and the saved, had vanished with the bond. Ilara turned to face him. Without the link, she couldn't feel his thoughts, but she could see the raw, unfiltered hunger in his eyes, a look that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with the woman standing before him. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out. This wasn't a reach for survival or a desperate grab for a tether. Her fingers brushed his jaw, the skin-to-skin contact sending a jolt through her that was sharper and sweeter than any psychic connection. Valerus closed his eyes, a shuddering breath escaping him as he finally leaned into her palm. It was a touch born of choice, a bridge built in the silence of their own minds. He pulled her into him, his arms a familiar fortress, but the embrace was different. It was a meeting of equals. The king had found his queen, And as the sun rose over a world that no longer knew their names, their new era began in the heat of a voluntary flame.